Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are taking our first look, oh god this thing is heavy, at the new GeForce RTX 3090, Nvidia's latest Titan class GPU. Though unlike past Titans, it's not actually called Titan. I guess Titan RTX was already taken and maybe RTX Titan would be a little bit confusing. Anyway, RTX 3090, it works for us, and when compared to many of the previous Titan class products that were actually called Titans, we feel the 3090 is a bit more significant. It's more like the Maxwell Titan X in the sense that it packs not just more VRAM, but also more cores than the next fastest GeForce GPU, which in this case is the RTX 3080. So 21% more CUDA cores and more than twice as much VRAM with an insane 24 gigabytes of GDDR6X memory. And of course, as you'd expect, it does come with a bit of a Titan price tag, $1,500 US, but I suppose when compared to some of the previous Titans we've seen more recently, that's not too bad. But anyway, you know what doesn't come with a Titan price tag? Today's sponsored product. Today's video sponsor is MSI and their award-winning B550 Gaming Edge Wi-Fi motherboard, the ultimate companion for the latest AMD Ryzen processors. It comes equipped with Wi-Fi 6, lightning-fast PCIe Gen 4, 2.5 gigabits per second networking, and outstanding VRM performance. This really is a board that does it all. When paired with the 8-core, 16-thread AMD Ryzen 7 3700X processor, you've got yourself a formidable system for gaming, content creation, and productivity. So no matter the task, MSI's B550 motherboards along with AMD's Ryzen processors have you covered. Enjoy more cores and more performance today via the links in the video description. Okay, so Nvidia really was quick to point out that despite the name, this is a Titan class product. And of course the implication there being that gamers really shouldn't expect something that's going to compete strongly in terms of cost per frame. Noting that this is a product for those that simply want the best, it's a no compromise type product. Nvidia also noted that with previous Titans, they were surprised by just how much demand there was for such a product. And they say that strong demand came from content creators as well as gamers seeking the ultimate performance, and no doubt those all-important bragging rights. So that really is the RTX 3090 in a nutshell. It's for those that can afford it and just want the best. The only potential use case where I'd say the 3090 is really required would be for those who can take advantage of the massive 24GB VRAM buffer. So this could be very beneficial for those using animation and 3D modeling tools like Autodesk Maya or Blender, for example. And it could also benefit video editors working with 8K raw footage. So if you do fall into one of those categories, the RTX 3090 is actually going to be exceptionally good value. And at this point, you've probably already heard enough and you've raced out to buy one. Typically though, here at Hardware Unboxed, we don't cater to professionals. So when it comes to GPU reviews, we're really all about those gaming benchmarks. And today's review really won't be any different, though it will very briefly touch on some Blender performance. But for the bulk of our audience, the interest really is in the gaming benchmarks. And while I will still look at stuff like cost per frame, I'm not going to weigh my conclusion as heavily on this metric as I normally would, as that's not what the RTX 3090 is all about. And really, you don't need a review to tell you that in terms of cost per frame, the 3090 is a bit of a terrible product. I guess, spoiler alert, gamers don't yet require 24 gigabytes of VRAM, so asking more than twice as much for a GPU that's only going to be at the absolute most 20% faster, well, that just doesn't make sense for those who care about value. Now, as usual, the focus of this review will be on the RTX 3090 as a GPU, so not Nvidia's Founders Edition graphics card. But because this thing is so insane, I'll give you a few quick stats. It measures 313mm long, stands 124mm tall, and is 52mm thick. So it is a bit of a beast in terms of dimensions, and as you've probably guessed, it does take up 3 expansion slots. But the most impressive stat is the weight. This thing tips the scales at 2,125 grams, making it the heaviest graphics card I've ever seen. Now, pushing and pulling air through this maze of heatsinks are 2 110mm fans, and like the RTX 3080 FE model, air's exhausted out all over the place, and we'll look at the thermal performance a little later on in the review. Then around at the I/O panel, we get the same configuration as the 3080 model. So there's a single HDMI 2.1 port and 3 DisplayPort 1.4a outputs. It is a seriously impressive graphics card and the best design Nvidia has produced by a country mile. Now, before we jump into the benchmarks, here's a quick side-by-side specifications comparison with the RTX 3080 and 2080 Ti. It is worth noting that both GPUs are based on the same GA102 die. The 3080 is just a cut-down version. As mentioned earlier, the 3090 packs 21% more CUDA cores, as well as 21% more texture mapping units, but just 17% more render output units or ROPs. In terms of core clock speeds, both are very similar, but the 3090 does receive slightly faster GDDR6X memory, hitting 19.5 gigabits per second, and when paired with the 384-bit wide memory bus is good for 935.8 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. So a 23% increase over the 3080. Based on those figures, you'd probably expect that at most, the 3090 will be around 17% faster than the 3080 in games. But due to the way these architectures typically scale, in most games, the gains are probably going to be quite a bit lower, and that means the 3090 is going to be a very small increase over the RTX 3080. Now, for testing, we're using our Ryzen 9 3950X test system featuring 4 sticks of low latency DDR4 3200 memory operating in a dual channel, dual rank configuration, and of course the focus will be on the 4K results, but it'll also be including the 1440p data as well. Starting with Death Stranding, we see that the 1440p results are very underwhelming, though we could be a little bit CPU limited here. Either way, it means for a lot of gamers, the gains at 1440p in this title are going to be very, very small. Even when increasing the resolution of 4K, which sees the GPU become the primary system bottleneck, the 3090 is just 6% faster than the 3080, taking the average frame rate from 107 FPS to 113 FPS. I really wasn't expecting much from the 3090, but I've got to say this is a very disappointing result. Next up, we have Horizon Zero Dawn, and here we're again looking at very weak performance gains at 1440p, just a 7% improvement here over the RTX 3080. Then as we move to the 4K resolution, it's worth noting that the only performance limiting component here is the graphics card, and despite that the 3090 is just 8% faster than the 3080, taking the average frame rate from 73 FPS to 79 FPS. That said, we do see a much healthier 18% boost to the 1% low performance, but even here, that's pretty underwhelming. Rainbow Six Siege sees a 10% boost at 1440p, as here we went from 327 FPS with the RTX 3080 to 360 FPS with the 3090. So, not amazing, but it is at least a double-digit gain. The 4K results are a little more impressive. Here we're looking at a 15% performance uplift, and spoiler alert, this is about the biggest margin we saw in the 14 game sample. So that being the case, I'm not going to bother going over the other 11 games that we have. It's pretty boring and very repetitive stuff. That being the case, let's just hit pause, or rather cancel, on the individual game graphs, and we'll just jump into the 14 game averages for the 1080p, 1440p and 4K data. Then of course we'll check out stuff like power consumption, cost per frame, and we'll also take a look at the margins seen in individual titles. Oh, and we'll also take a quick look at some Blender render performance before wrapping this thing up. Starting with the 1080p data, here we're looking at a 5% performance uplift over the 3080 and a 21% increase over the 2080 Ti, and really they are the only two relevant GPUs for comparison. Then at 1440p, the margin over the 3080 grew to 8%, and the margin over the 2080 Ti grew to 32%. So spending 114% more on the RTX 3090 is going to be a pretty tough sell for an 8% increase at 1440p, but then who am I kidding? Those with deep pockets won't hesitate for a moment to snap them up at that price to performance ratio. Finally, for those gaming at 4K, the RTX 3090 offered on average 11% more performance over the 3080, and if you're coming from an RTX 2080 Ti, that's a decent 45% increase for a 25% increase in price. Now, in terms of power consumption, the RTX 3090 didn't consume that much more power than the RTX 3080, at least when measuring the entire system consumption from the wall. Here we're still shy of 600 watts, so a decent 750 watt unit will have you more than covered, at least prior to any overclocking. Using the NVIDIA PCAT tool, we see that the 3090 consumed just 6% more power than the 3080, which is very surprising, though it was only 11% faster in this test. Still not a bad result, and it explains why the RTX 3090 FE card runs so cool, which we'll look at in a moment. But first, here's a look at performance per watt. Based on the figures we just saw, the RTX 3090 is actually better than the 3080 in terms of performance per watt, and no doubt this is due to a bidding process that sees the best silicon reserved for the 3090. Still, in terms of efficiency, the 3090 is surprisingly good. The cool thing about the massive RTX 3090 Founders Edition graphics card is the cool operating temperatures. Well, that and the fact that it is virtually silent. After an hour of gaming, the fans spun at just over 1000 RPM, where they were quieter than the other fans in our test system, and therefore the graphics card couldn't be heard. Despite the low operating volume, the GPU peaked at just 66 degrees, which is, again, very impressive, and here it maintained an average clock speed of 1830 MHz. So, very impressive stuff, but also not terribly surprising given how absolutely massive the Founders Edition 3090 is. Here's a look at the cost per frame data, which again isn't something those typically interested in a product like the RTX 3090 really care about, but we have the data anyway, so why not share it? No surprises here, the RTX 3090 is a terrible value proposition for gamers, but it's also very amusing to me to see that despite costing $1,500 US, it's still actually better value than the RTX 2080 Ti, and by a reasonable margin as well. In fact, at the 4K resolution, the RTX 3090 is considerably better value than the RTX 2080 Ti, and it's really not that much worse than parts released last year like the Radeon 7, for example. It's also crazy to see that in modern games, it's really not that much worse than something like the GTX 1080, a GPU that was actually class leading for its time. Since I did skip over looking at the frame rates in all 14 games, here's a look at the percentage gains offered by the 3090 over the 3080 in all titles tested, starting with the 1440p data. As you can see, at best it was 16% faster, seen in World War Z, but typically we're looking at high single-digit gains. Now at 4K, we're not CPU limited in any of the games, and a 5.3 GHz 10700K, for example, provides the exact same frame rates in all titles tested with the RTX 3090. Again, the 3090 was just 10% faster on average, with the biggest margin once again seen in World War Z, where the 3090 was just 18% faster. Now, for those of you hoping to upgrade from a 2080 Ti, you're at most going to see around a 44% performance improvement, which is what we saw in Resident Evil 3. Typically though, you are looking at more like a 30% performance uplift, which is about what the 2080 Ti offered over the 1080 Ti for a 70% increase in price. So from that perspective, the 3090 is kind of great value. And here we see that the margins are even better at 4K, and now the 3090 is up to 58% faster than the 2080 Ti, and this time that's seen when testing with World War Z, though it is worth noting that you will see margins as low as 34% in games like Gears 5. Since we don't test productivity performance of GPUs in any of our GPU reviews, I went and quickly tested a few GPUs in Blender. Here we can see that the Radeon 7 was comparable to the RTX 2080 Ti in this application, and that made it a pretty great value option, though it also wasn't much faster than the vanilla 2080. Anyway, the 3080 was a little over twice as fast as the Radeon 7 in this test, boosting performance by 108%, or if you go the other way, it reduced the render time by 52%. Again, we see that the RTX 3090 was just 18% faster than the 3080, so that's in line with our best case gaming performance margin, and this means unless your workload requires more than 10 GB of VRAM, you're just much better off with the RTX 3080 in terms of value. So as I said earlier, it's a pretty simple equation for those running productivity tasks. If your workload requires a lot more than 10 GB of VRAM, the 3090 will be a godsend. If not, it's kind of pointless and it's just something you'd buy because I guess you can. So that's the GeForce RTX 3090. It's not terribly exciting, I guess. Certainly not as exciting as last week's RTX 3080 release. But as soon as Jensen said this was a Titan-class product, I really did know what we were in for. If you're a gamer, this release is very boring in my opinion and very pointless. Even if we did see the 20% performance boost that many had predicted, that would have been still pretty weak given the price, but it would have been certainly more interesting than what we ended up with. In short, the RTX 3090 makes no sense for gamers. It's really that simple. The massive 24GB VRAM buffer has no appeal here, and despite Nvidia's best efforts, 8K gaming it's not really a thing. Hell, 4K gaming is still pretty niche. That said, I did try out 8K gaming, and it was quite impressive seeing 60 FPS and Doom Eternal at this extremely extreme resolution. It was also possible to average 60 FPS in Control with the help of DLSS, rendering at its lowest possible resolution of 1440p. So, not really 8K gaming then. And without DLSS, Control ran at 5 FPS. It is a little bit sketchy claiming 8K gaming performance, given that for the most part you will require DLSS support for it to happen. That said, Doom Eternal did work very well without DLSS because of course the game doesn't support it. It looked great, and we saw VRAM usage hit 16GB, and that's actual usage, not just allocation. Anyway, I seriously doubt too many gamers are keen for that sweet 60Hz experience at 8K. And on that note, we do know that most of you are now targeting 1440p 144Hz because we've run some polls in the past, and that was by far the most popular choice for people either having just upgraded or wanting to upgrade. So that being the case, it is quite disappointing to see that the RTX 3090 has little to offer over the 3080 here. And it's also true when using a heavily overclocked Intel processor. But as I've already said now, gaming is kind of a waste with the 3090. You just do it because you can. And the same is also true for productivity tasks. Unless you can utilize that extra VRAM, the 3090 doesn't really make sense over the 3080. But as I've said numerous times now, if you do require 24GB of VRAM, or certainly much more than 10GB of VRAM, the RTX 3090 will be, well, pretty awesome. Previously, you were looking at having to spend more like $2,500 US on the Titan RTX for that sort of memory capacity. And that means you're now getting the bigger memory buffer with a much faster GPU at a much lower price. So a bit of a win-win there. Other than that, Nvidia's Founders Edition model is super impressive. It's also, well, it's super massive and super heavy. That's part of what makes it very impressive. And this is probably going to be, I shouldn't call it right now because I haven't tested any AIB cards yet, but at the very least, given the thermals we've seen, all that sort of stuff, this is certainly going to be one of the best 3090 graphics cards. But we will be looking at the Asus Strix and the MSI Gaming X Trio very shortly on the channel, so make sure you stay tuned for that. And as for this review, I think that is going to do it for this one. So I'll wrap it up here. Let me know what you thought about the RTX 3090 in the comment section below. Was it disappointing? Was it pretty much what you thought it would be? Especially after Jensen said it was a Titan class product. But anyway, let me know in the comment section below. If you liked the video, you know what to do. If you'd like to check out the Patreon stuff, we will have a live stream on Monday. So that's coming up next week, early next week. There'll be a live stream for Patreon members, so you can tune in and watch that if you are a Patreon member. You'll also get access to our exclusive Discord chat where you can talk with Tim and myself, behind the scenes videos where we talk about all kinds of things, behind the scenes type things, and Q&As. Anyway, if you're interested, link is in the video description. If not, that is fine. And I would like to just thank you for watching this review. I'm your host, Steve, and I will see you again next time. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14.